I'm thrilled to have two really important guests with us. The first is David Dunn. David Dunn is a serial entrepreneur and a founder of Elemental AI. He built a pretty transformational digital ad platform and did it at scale, and then took all of that expertise and moved it into an AI company where he seeks to kind of get embedded inside of organizations to help think about digital transformation at scale. And so David's here not as a theorist, but as an operator. Jack Hanlon, who is Gen AI at Meta. Jack has had an unbelievable career in a very short period of time. He's really and truly looking every day at the way that AI shows up for 3 billion people, right? So that's not a user base, that's a civilization. And this is his everyday gig. And before that, he ran data at Reddit. And just because dealing with AI at a planetary scale isn't keeping him busy enough, he's also a professor at Stern Business School. And so what Jack is doing is at the very frontier of AI, he's reducing it to like digestible concepts for us mere humans. And so it's a treat to have Jack with us. And to kick things off, Jack's going to say a few things, but let me just tell you how it's going to go. We're going to break it down into kind of three sections. Talk about kind of where it is today, how personal, maybe there's a personal productivity unlock that we can talk about. And then at the enterprise level, where's it going? And I think the goal is if we walk out of here a little more informed and excited than when we walked in, that's success. And we want to open it up so that we can have a real conversation with the folks in the room. So with that, I'm going to ask Jack to kick it off.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me. And I love this crowd. So look, I think one of the things that's really interesting about AI is it's a sort of Schrodinger's cat of technology right now, while simultaneously it's going to end everything, and also it can't help us at all. I somehow have no way to include it in my business, but it's also Skynet. And like, so somehow these things are pretty far apart in the spectrum, so we have to be able to discern where this thing actually falls, right? And so if you look at the 80s, you have a Nobel laureate named Robert Solow, who famously identifies something called the productivity paradox, where he says, we see computers everywhere except in the productivity statistics. So this is the 80s at the time, and they're saying computers, we actually don't see any productivity gains. Now that's an insane statement, and clearly people were seeing some productivity gains, but in all the methods we had to measure productivity gains, we couldn't show them. So then today, when you see an article that says, AI, where's the productivity? You have to ask yourself, okay, we did this with computers, we did this with mobile, we did this with the internet, we did this with cloud. And so either, you say, although all of those times we experienced the same thing, I think that this time is different and that this isn't going to go anywhere, which would be a pretty wild claim considering the direction things are going. But you could say that. Or you could say, okay, I sort of get where this is in the sort of proverbial diffusion curve of the technology, and I got to figure out where I stand on it. Now, what's so interesting about Solow's work is he didn't just merely identify this productivity paradox. That doesn't get you a Nobel laureate, it turns out. That's just like an interesting tweet. But like instead, in order to figure this out, he had to ask, why is this the case? And why is this the case? What do we see? And so what he found was that the issue was that firm-level performance variation was so dramatic. Some firms were seeing exceptional gains from digitization and the computerization of the workplace, and some firms were seeing negative gains. Not no gains, negative gains. That the reality was, as they were instituting new technologies, they would become less productive, and then they would become even worse. Their productivity would go down even more. Whereas other companies found their productivity would get slightly less productive and then all of a sudden skyrocket into something different. And so understanding the variation in firm level productivity was the gift that he gave that made him the famous economist that he, is recognized as today. And so the thing we want to understand then is, how do we understand firm level variation, and how do we make sure that our firms are on the right side of that so that we're not the cautionary tale that ends up bringing the average down to, actually, wait, there's no productivity here. Because the reality is very few people are going to see the middle. People are either going to see significant productivity or they will see potentially negative productivity. And I can explain that a little as we go. But as just sort of my appetizer for the conversation, I want you to consider that it's this firm level variation that's the consideration we all have to take into account as we're asking ourselves how we want to engage.
So you have a room full of people it's been put together and curated. So everybody here is involved in running complex organizations or complex things. And I wonder if you could talk about the gap between what we think AI is and what it really is today.
So I think that one of the most interesting things about AI is that it's perhaps the earliest broad level exposure on a technology that we've ever experienced. So like if you think at some point the mobile phone became possible because some person invented that key final piece that made it a real product, no one on the street was like, did you hear about the XYZ capacitor? Like no one talked about technology that way. We didn't have that level of exposure at the granular level to what was going on. And we weren't so ahead on what's going on. This technology became popular at a point at which it was so unbelievably nascent. The edges of it were quite sharp. So chances are, if you were an early adopter and you tried this out, you had simultaneously like, wow, this is cool, and simultaneously, wow, this is horrible. And powerful, they were concerned it was going to create global cybersecurity issues because the technology was so unbelievably effective at finding and exploiting cybersecurity issues at firms that it was beyond human capability on identifying and capitalizing on them. So what they did was they gave the technology to us and a bunch of other tech companies that run a lot of the infrastructure on the internet and said, hey, can you use this first and make sure that everything looks cool on your end so we can get some level of protection. And then they're building in safety things around it. So we went from when you potentially used this before, where you were like, it can't count how many R's are in the word strawberry and it hallucinates or whatever, to now it's like, oh, this is actually superior in a variety of capacities, especially as it relates to technology, superior in a variety of capacities than human capacity. So I think we need to make sure that we're updating our priors as we go about what we think the technology is capable of and not getting frozen in place about like, the technology does this. Because I can tell you that even within a 4 to 6 week timeline, that nearly anything you say about the technology does this is probably no longer true.
Wow. So David, let's go to, you walk into a C-suite where individuals are looking for some guidance. Is there terror? Is there fascination, hallucination? What is the feeling in the room when you're talking to companies about transformation in the space? Like, how is it actually happening inside of a boardroom or a C-suite?
Well, we're seeing something that, just listening to Jack and the sheer pace that's, maybe it's not evident to everybody, the sheer pace that things are moving at, but there's never been a technology that's moved at this pace before. It used to be that you could look at 12, 18, 24 months and be reasonably accurate about where things would be or what was going to be possible in that time frame. And instead, we have this kind of compounding effect that's happening. And inside the companies we talk to, we find kind of quite a range, but I would say fundamentally curiosity about it. People are wondering, I'm pretty sure this could be good for us, not quite sure how. And it does feel like we need to get other things in order before we can tackle it. So that's one end of the spectrum. And I think another end of the spectrum is people who are experimenting and trying different things, but they tend to be very, very point solution oriented. And that might work really well in a big tech company where, if you can automate 1,000 processes at scale, then that's very beneficial. But the big thing that we find inside of companies is that people don't know where to focus. And so maybe they'll start trying some experiments that actually won't really move the needle for the company. They won't generate any growth, which of course everybody wants to do. And maybe it'll make one person's job a little bit easier. And so as a general statement, we find that the companies who are leaning in a little beyond that and trying to figure out how will we impact the company, how will we grow faster, how will we operate better, how will we service our customers with more precision, more speed, Those are the companies that are sort of starting to see the benefits, but really it's quite a big spectrum.
So you're not alone. JLL recently did a study that said 87% of commercial real estate companies have doubled the amount of money that they're dedicating to technology and AI over the last year. And 60% of commercial real estate companies are massively unprepared strategically, organizationally, and technologically for what's coming. And so that just says the state of play for the industry is a bit confused and certainly hasn't begun to see the beginnings of what's to come. And so why don't we start with the kind of the personal productivity unlock and the idea that if people in this room are not doing 3 things that they should be doing, let's just get real tangible and say, like, if you're not doing these things, when you leave here, you really ought to think about it. Or if you are doing these things, you want to stop.
Cool. Yeah, I think the 2 biggest ones by far are sort of like the concept of a second brain and being able to use agents effectively. So on the second brain concept, I'd say this has become fairly ubiquitous in the Valley, but effectively you build up context around who are the key people that I work with, what are my key OKRs, where are the dashboards, whatever. I set it up with hooks to my email, my calendar, everything else. And then I just take notes throughout the week in my one-on-ones and I drop them in and it updates all of the context. And then I can have a conversation with it like I've outsourced a tremendous amount of sort of like executive decision making, not strategic decision making, but like what are the 3 most important things I need to do today? And it's like, hey, here are the 35 emails you haven't read. Here's the 2 emails worth reading. Here's the deck that person sent you that you've been avoiding. You really only need to read slide 17, and you can delegate it to Natalie, who can handle it for you, right? And the technology does that kind of stuff incredibly effectively. And so setting up a second brain, I don't know, it'd take you maybe an hour, 2 hours. Setting that up and then starting to engage with it every day, I'm not kidding around when I tell you that I can't imagine going back to working the way that I did before I had it.
And how long ago was that?
February. And so I was just sitting in a bench in the other room as you folks were walking in, and I had received a message that we needed someone was looking for something. And so I just told the second brain, I was like, hey, set up 2 agents, have one research around our company, all of the instances in which technology X exists, have another agent research what the key startups are doing that, and have the third agent take all of that, put it together in a summary, write the document in my voice, and load the Google Doc, and I'm seeing people coming in, and I check back in 2 minutes later, and I read the doc, and it's very good. I say, change X, Y, and Z about this, and ship it. And so that would have taken, how much time would that research have taken? I would have had to give that to 1 or 2 people. It was done while you folks were walking in and saying hi to people you haven't seen in a little while. I didn't think about it for 2 seconds. And so, that's one of 2,000 things like that I do in a week. So I would say that is something I would immediately engage with. And by the way, if you want to set it up, rather than looking for an article for it, why don't you just ask Claude how to set it up? And it will tell you, here's what you need to do. The second thing I would think about is this concept of agents. I'm planning a wedding right now, and when I say I'm planning a wedding, I mean that Claude is planning most of my wedding, which is to say, I was like, here are the kind of places that Sarah and I are interested in. Make me a list of the right places. I made those places. I say, cool, what's the contact information on all those places? Great. Draft an email that's specific to each of those places about what I might be interested about it and the questions I might have. Great. Create a spreadsheet that has the key columns that I need to consider for the decision and populate the spreadsheet as emails come in that have the information from each of the places. And now I have this spreadsheet with all the places we'd consider. And now I just ask Claude when I have a question about it, where I'm like, well, if we didn't want 100 people and we only wanted 85, does that take certain venues out of the running or make certain more attractive, et cetera? And so I'm just working with it along the way. It's cut out probably, I don't know, 50 hours of administrative work so far.
Great. So, David, when we hear these terms, I'm using AI or I'm doing work that's AI enabled. Can you break that down for us and tell us what is the difference between those two statements?
Well, Jack just described an example of where you're really using an AI-enabled process to accelerate your work and go deeper, faster, wider than you could possibly do in your own. There are sort of examples a little bit closer to, let's call it the simple end of the spectrum, where maybe you just are trying to build a deck, and you have an important meeting coming up, and you need some help with that. And on that end of the spectrum, just using any of the large language models as a thought partner, it just requires a little bit of skill in terms of the prompting, which is, I'd say, the first place that people could spend more time, just being a bit smarter about the prompting. In fact, use the LLM to teach you how to do better prompting would be a good starting point. But there are people who are just finding value at that level, which is really very simple. Jack's example is quite sophisticated, and I'm sure it'll be in 3 months much more sophisticated, because it will compound and compound and compound. But when we talk about being AI enabled, it's really all the way at the end of the spectrum where, if you think about, maybe it's easy to sort of think about a tech company versus a regular, construction company. Inside of a tech company, everything they do is focused on maximizing everything they can possibly do with AI. Inside of a construction company, you're thinking about how to just build buildings and do your day-to-day work. And so it's very difficult to think about being fully AI enabled like a tech company. And so we kind of create this division where we think, well, they're really AI native companies because it's in their DNA. It's not in the DNA of the construction company. So, but how can we enable that kind of thinking to permeate the business? And so if you were very simple about it, you'd say most businesses have an accounting team, marketing, sales, maybe legal, maybe compliance, operations. And in every one of those areas, there's opportunities to significantly improve how the company runs. And that's better for everybody. Maybe you could think about it in the context of, as a fully AI-enabled company, maybe you could double in size without hiring any more people. Or maybe the people you're hiring are all AI-skilled workers, and so now you can produce more work as a company. And so better, faster, smarter, more precise. These are all things that an AI-enabled company can produce. So you can kind of imagine if you start at very simple and you can get yourself all the way over there, there's a huge opportunity.
So if you're not an AI native company, you can still very easily be AI enabled. If you take the time and the effort to do it.
If you're not an AI native company, you have to start thinking about it in a very kind of, what does it mean to my business, the business of the business I'm in? Will my customers accept it? Can I, how quickly can I adopt this? How quickly can I move? How much resources do I need to actually make the shift? But absolutely, you can think, as Jack was saying, the time horizon's coming closer. So if you just said, what could you do in the next 12 months? And you looked department by department, you could absolutely forecast your way to being AI enabled.
So I'm going to just point out a creed that Jack knows well, which is move fast and break things. In our industry, we like to move fast, but breaking things is a little scary when you're building a super tall skyscraper, a headquarters building, or homes for people. So the idea of breaking things in commercial real estate development is complicated, right? It's expensive, and we know that when an asset's broken, we know what happens to it. It's not a good ending. So your world is very different than our world, right? So in terms of thinking about this in a way that allows us to move faster, but also recognizing, again, I'm not going to try to say our business is more complex than yours, but it is so, it's so tangible and so, well, we also are still doing things the way our great-grandparents did things. That's part of the problem, is that it is not a very efficient process of putting a building together. It's gotten better, but just talk a little bit about how the creed that really built your industry could apply to this industry.
As a polite knock to my own industry, yes, I'm a machine learning expert before AI and AI, but when we call people in my industry software engineers, I can't help but be like, so do you know what actual engineers do?
That you guys could answer.
I'm not sure we're engineers, but that's a nice idea, to your point. If if I ship something that isn't quite right, the machine's like, hey, this isn't quite right, but if you build a bridge, it's not quite right. But in any event, I'd say, yeah, look, move fast and break things. One thing I really admire about some of the things happening in tech is there's a bit of creative destruction happening, and the willingness to redefine the way you do things and lead from the front is key. Because like one of the jokes I've been saying is one of the key themes to the AI era is, everyone below my level really has to change. My level is unique in a way that I can't change anything about it. AI hasn't reached that yet, but everyone who works for me better start thinking about this, and like that's where everybody is right now. It's one level below you. It's n-1. And so, I do think that is naive about this, frankly. And in some ways, the way I'd say to start is just building a level of comfort with the technology. So a friend of mine, what he's doing is he's building a mechanism to help handle his 2 daughters' schedules. How their summer calendar. He's got 2 kids who are 5 and 7. Their summer calendars are insane. And he literally just is like, I need the AI to help me manage the calendar of these 2 girls. And so he's starting there. Like the likelihood you're going to have some disastrous mistake with this is pretty low. I think if they miss that one play date, we're going to be able to say we're sorry. But generating a level of facility and comfort with just knowing what these things tend to be better at than others alone is probably the game. Because even if you're like, oh, I'm not sure it's there, I'm not sure it's ready for us. It's like if you knew you were going on a trip to another country, would you be like, well, I don't want to learn anything about the language or the culture because there's a 5% chance my flight's going to be canceled. Like that sounds insane when you say it, but then we're like, I'm just not touching AI because I don't know. Like, is the reason you're not touching it is because you really don't think the impact is there? Or is the reason you're not touching it because you're busy and you have a bunch of other stuff and there's fear around it? It feels like it's moving too fast. And if that's the issue, the humorous response I have for you is you could always ask AI. It's actually surprisingly good at helping with these things. Like for me, I don't get to read that many papers anymore, which is unfortunate because I did like that part of my job and it's part of the reason I'm a professor. But God, it's amazing when I give it a paper, just being like, hey, talk me through what's the most important thing here? Is that true? Is that how that works? How does this relate to this other work? It's an amazing thought partner that never tires of my incredibly boring and dumb questions. So if you're ever worried about like, I don't want to ask this because will I feel it, will I sound like I don't know what I'm talking about? Yeah, it's very not judgmental. It's nice in that regard.
Great. So I want to just touch on 2 things, and I really want to open it up so people can ask questions. And please be provocative if you're comfortable with being honest. I mean, if you can be funny, that's even better. So David, talk about what is AI slop, and how are we supposed to think about it? What is that?
Well, AI slop can also lead to an avalanche of work. And so if we think about, the way we've worked for such a long time, the expectation was that work would be refined and refined before it was presented, and then it would be refined further to be presented, and so on. And so you ultimately get to a really good work product. Maybe that takes a week or 2. And what is happening now is people get excited about the possibilities. They go in, they make some, broad statements and questions, and then they get a report back, and they forward that 48-page report to their boss. Except that the boss has 17 direct reports, and so there's now an avalanche of this work coming in, and the work hasn't been vetted. And it's a really big problem, particularly so if you're in a precision business. Because now the boss who's receiving this stuff, at whatever level they are, has to interpret it and validate or invalidate the work and push that back out. And that creates a huge burden on the recipient. And so what we kind of look at is there will be slop if you don't manage it. If you don't put some guardrails in place, your organization will be producing an enormous amount of rubbish. And so conversely, if you anticipate that, you can put, some good guardrails in place, good training in place, and a set of expectations that your fingerprints need to be all over your work. Like it's your questions, it's your review, it's your interpretation, and it's your analysis of what in this work it is that stands out and why it's worth your time to review it. So I suppose AI slop is the disease that can spread like a cancer, and we have to stop that from happening. But conversely, as Jack was pointing out, it can also be trained in such a way to produce excellent work and save a huge amount of time. So I think if everybody's aware of this issue and you're on the lookout for it, then I would say you can avoid a very, very costly consumption of your time.
I just want to say, like, I couldn't agree more with this. I will say that this is a common first issue, the proliferation of people producing stuff that, like, at 10,000 feet seems legitimate, and then when you look at it, is like sort of horrible. It has 86,000 M dashes, and every paragraph ends with, that's not X, that's Y. You know, and like once you start seeing it on LinkedIn, you want to light yourself on fire. But like, you know, but I do think things things you can do here that are relevant are because I'm trying to rise to your challenge of tactical, and so things you can do here that are relevant is I've trained a Claude skill to understand how I evaluate business ideas, and all of my directs have that skill now. And so I say, you have to run anything you're going to send to me through the skill first, which will ask you the most common questions that I would ask, and then refine it and then send it to me. And I can't tell you how many extra sessions we've saved by just being like consistently be able to answer these questions. And the other thing I would say is, in large measure, we're trying to move away from slides and saying that sometimes slides are a mechanism we have at our disposal to transmit an idea because it's too time consuming or expensive to produce a higher resolution version of the idea. But in reality, we want to get closer to the idea faster. So more and more, if I'm doing meetings with various executives in the company, I'm showing up with working prototypes where I used to show up with slides, because it takes me just as little time to create a working prototype as it does the slides. And the conversation is going to be 100 times better because we're not talking about some conceptual product. The person is on their iPhone or on their Android actually using it. And they can give me feedback that's much more real. Everybody's been in that meeting where some executive doesn't get the thing or has a misconception about it, and everyone in the room is like trying to nudge them in the right direction, and you run the risk of like 45 minutes of exceptionally wasted time. And then it's amazing, you really do avoid that when people are engaging with the thing and not with some sort of ethereal concept. So like part of it is pushing us away from some of the artifacts that we were using before that are most commonly fall into the morass of AI slop.
Awesome. So the last thing I want to ask before we open it up is about cybersecurity, and because folks in this room are in enterprises where they need some guardrails around all of these tools, and how in the most concise and understandable way should folks think about going into their organization tomorrow and trying to push a little bit into areas maybe heretofore they haven't, but yet they're worried about malware, they're worried about all the kinds of things that we read about where if it's not managed properly, it can potentially do damage to the platform.
I think one of the biggest things is like you could fall into the trap of thinking that because code is easier to generate or products are easier to build faster, that everyone should be shipping products themselves. And that is a really reliable way of shipping something that looks like it works but has 16 different mistakes on the back that you don't realize that are security vulnerabilities. So I'd just be really careful about externalizing products that weren't built by technologists. And that's not a thing to keep me in business. I'm saying just make sure you have technologists at your disposal who you can have at least do a once over on these things. I'm not sure that everyone creating their own apps is the world we live in right now, unless you want those apps to get hacked like pretty constantly. So that would be the biggest thing I'd think about. There's other stuff, but honestly, the other stuff isn't going to be an issue for you for another 6 to 12 months, so why don't we just stay there? Yeah.
the average person who's vibe coding today, quick hands up, how many of you are vibe coded already?
Yes.
So probably about 20%. And so for the folks who are vibe coding who have no training in code, it's going to be very hard for you to evaluate whether or not the thing you've created has risk to it. And so let's for a moment say, 6 or 8 weeks ago, Claude Code, a significant amount of their code base was leaked. And who picked that code up? Within 24 hours, the biggest threat actors in the world, North Korea, China, Russia, all had that code. But what they did with that code within 24 hours was they forked it. And that means they took, word-based code and turned it into Python or some other form, and basically then they own it. But what that allows them to do is to spoof and pretend like they are Claude Code. And so if they want to target a company now, they understand exactly how that platform works. And so for any user of Claude Code, unbeknownst to you, there are now about 1,000 new attack vectors that didn't exist 6 weeks ago against everybody who's got Claude Code installed on their desktop. And so that literally didn't exist. So now you imagine your computer's behind the company network, and you have unwittingly brought all that risk inside the company. And we already have examples of CFOs waking up to find that the bank account's empty. So this is not like a might happen, could happen. It is already happening. In fact, a friend of mine who's a CFO of a company, he's not actually CFO of the company anymore, funny enough, but he came in one morning and they had spoofed him and the controller, and they had taken over the whole accounting department relationship at the bank. And not only that, but they'd convinced the bank that he'd been fired and that the controller was no longer in control. And so they literally wired $2 million out of the account that morning and approved the wires, of course, because they had all the controls set in place. So these things are actually happening. And so when we think about the risk to a company, we have to think about it in a kind of a defensive and offensive kind of a manner. And that's beyond the thinking for most people who are vibe coding. Right? But if you think about what are all the things you can do to proactively protect yourselves, and what are all the things you can proactively do to defend yourselves, that kind of thinking needs to go hand in hand with creating applications. And so Jack made the point, well, you should have an engineer review it. I would say that, probably best to have an engineering plan for what you're going to create, and not be sending something to an engineer after you've made it to say, is this okay? Because they're not going to understand what you've made, right? And maybe you can use an LLM to evaluate your work, and that would be certainly a good step. But again, I think it's just more about being very proactive and assuming that there's risk, and a lot of it, and that risk is going to keep compounding. And so by all means, lean in, but lean in with a lot of awareness about the risks, and surround yourselves with people who can help you to manage that.
Terrific. Okay, let's get chatting. Anyone who wants to ask a question, we have mics available, and yeah, it's awesome. And I think what you should just know that we tried to balance the room. So we have creatives, we have lawyers, and I'm obsessed with asking everybody in our business like how they're thinking about it. And there are no bad questions or comments. So let's just open it up. We're all friends. You're here for a reason. So who's first? Yes.
Thank you. That was so fascinating. I want to know your opinions on the supposed AI bubble. Is AI slop a symptom of that bubble? And what are the tools, use cases, and companies or products that will transcend the bubble?
Having seen where this technology was, like when I was at Reddit, we helped launch the original ChatGPT because Sam Altman was the chairman of our board at that point, so we worked closely with OpenAI. Having seen what that technology looked like then and understanding why it was exciting and seeing it now, there's no universe in which the trajectory of this is not as significant from an impact perspective as any of the other technologies I talked about, be it the internet, mobile, computerization. Cloud is probably less impactful. There's just no world in which we're not on that trajectory. I say this with my professor hat on, not my industry hat on. I certainly have questions about the existing valuations of some of the companies with respect to multiples and revenue and things like that. As an academic, I'm looking at those and the math. Really, you really have to squint at that math. But in terms of the arc the technology is on, I'd be willing to wager absolutely anything that this is going to be ubiquitous and in all of your lives, increasingly to a level that you are very surprised even in 9 to 12 months. Just agents, as the agent concept proliferates, it's going to make so many things that are dumb and time consuming in your life so much easier. It's going to be hard to avoid adoption.
I think it also accelerates some pretty phenomenal things like robots, which we're not necessarily talking about in this conversation, but just stop and consider for a moment the millions of tasks that could be done in the world by a robot who doesn't tire out. The battery may need to be recharged, but a few years ago, went on a vacation to Cabo, and they had these amazing people there, and they went by the name Tassanis, and we're thinking, oh my God, if you could replicate that in your home life, it would be incredible. Just anticipate your every need, and there were 3 steps ahead of you at all times. Wow, that's amazing. But this was a human, for sure, and at that time, you couldn't imagine that, okay, there's a world in which you could recreate that with a robot. And when the first robots were being produced a couple of years ago and they would show videos of them doing backflips and stuff, you'd say, interesting, but long way from thinking that that's going to be in my house. But when you have an AI-enabled robot in your house that actually can learn from you and has access to maybe a small language model that's on board, has all your context, and has the ability at your request to reach out and consult a large language model if it needs more intel for you, that's a crazy thing, right? So now everything Jack's been talking about, which is very virtual, is actually in your home. That would have been inconceivable before the large language models came about, and now that's probably just a couple of years away. But the point about the stocks is an important one, because there is concern that these are so hyper-valued that there could be a burst, and if that was to happen, it would be pretty cataclysmic to the markets. I mean, the only thing I could say to that is that if you look at just one company, Anthropic, their revenue hit 10 billion in, I think it was October, and 47 billion last month. And there has never been in the history of companies a company that grew at that pace ever. Nothing like it. So I do think there's risk of a toppy thing, but if you were to say, well, okay, will that company be a $500 billion company in 2 years? I'd be betting that it will be, actually. So maybe not such a big bubble after all, but risk nonetheless.
Hi, Gene with a firm called Denim Wolf. I want to test out a theory I have, and I'm curious what you guys think about it, which is the reason that the real estate industry has been so slow to integrate AI is because it is, I mean, per your comment before about it being the way that your grandparents ran the real estate industry is still the same way. It's inherently and intentionally full of friction and inefficiency because it is a relational business. And that is deeply ingrained into the culture. And so even though we have opportunities to get more efficient in the way that we do decks and how we process our data and documents, and we should do better at that foundationally, there's a piece of it where people actually want it to be inefficient because they want the moment where they look someone in the eye and shake hands and they know that person and they trust that person. And that's also the way that data moves in that, like, no offense to anyone who works for CoStar here, but if you're looking for information, you can go to CoStar and you're going to want to check that data. And by calling a friend and making sure that the land basis it's reporting for the Mabel transaction is actually correct, because it may or may not be. So I guess my question is just, if you accept my premise, what do we do about the fact that this might be an industry that actually wants inefficiency?
I mean, I definitely accept that premise. I'm an outsider on this, so I can't speak to the specifics there. But I'd say many industries are like this, and I do a lot of work with retail, because I used to be in that industry as well. And I'd say there's a lot of things about retail that are very old-fashioned behind the scenes. You know, I was at Walmart. They have, you know, a lot of times in a meeting they'll ask, what would Sam Walton have done? You know, and chances are Sam Walton, if you told him what AI was, probably wouldn't know. And so that, you know, that has a limited value in certain discussions. But I would say to get tangible for a moment, I would say I don't think anyone was, you know, I don't know. There's going to be one person who's going to disagree. I think very few people get out of bed in the morning and be like, I can't wait to log into Salesforce. You know, or be like, God, I just love filing my expenses in Concur. You know, like, you were made for more, right? You were made for more. You're better than that. I believe in you, you know, if you're in this room at a minimum. But in reality, so what I think about on this is not how do we eliminate the human element, which never goes away, you know, but rather how do we eliminate all the stuff that doesn't add value to your day? You know, it's like, I want to spend as much time as possible with the people I know and love. I'm not looking to outsource that. You know, there's plenty of other things that stop me from spending that time, that stop me from doing the things that I think that I'm best at every day. And if I could eliminate every single one of those, I'd be a lot happier.
I think there's also a world in which both things can be true. You can still have the high touch business, but you know, just imagine, we were talking to a client the other day, and they described putting a meeting together, and it took 3 weeks to get the meeting scheduled. Now, in that 3 weeks, the carrying costs for the $500 million parcel of land were pretty significant. So what if you could schedule that meeting in 3 days instead of 3 weeks? And by the way, that's a lot of people running and chasing each other, trying to lock in something as simple as a meeting. So you can just imagine in this business the opportunity for time compression, so you can do more work with more of the people you want, more often, with less roadblocks. That's pretty appealing. And some of those agents Jack was talking about could be very helpful.
Josh, you want to ask a question?
Sure, thank you. Josh Winefsky, I'm a transactional real estate lawyer. I actually asked Claude to come up with a good question that would make me sound smart, and its suggestions were not good. David, you mentioned precision, and I thought that that like really resonated with me because my entire career really rests on being able to be precise. And I do have, I think one of you also mentioned the word fear, and I think that there's a lot of discrepancy, or those butt heads, right? But to me, there are administrative tasks that seem to work really, really well, and then there's substantive precision, and that's the part where I don't really have a grasp on like how good can that be in assisting me in that goal of being substantively precise. And this is not about cutting down on billable hours. It's using it as a tool to be more excellent at what we do. And so I'm curious for your take on like that, the use of AI for substantive precision, and where are we in reaching that?
Yeah, so I still generally think of AI in my work as an intern, and you trust an intern with handling your coffee order, you know, like, but you maybe don't trust an intern with whether or not you should do that multi-billion-dollar deal. So to like yeah, I'm sure Max is awesome. Max crushes it. But I mean, you know, so what I think about is just changes what I ask it. Not the level of question, I want to be clear, but how much guidance I need to give it. So for example, you know, if I was trying to, I'm trying to think something that's not so abstruse for the crowd, but like, if I was trying to do some interesting thing that's very specific to my work, I probably wouldn't ask it something like, how do I ensure that human raters of content are doing a good job, or like build a system to do that? I would probably be like, hey, I need you to write a script that leverages the Dawodsky algorithm to be able to take in this type of data and output it in this way. So I'm being very clear about the thing that I want and making a very deliberate choice. And I'm also guiding it towards code, because something that like I won't bore people with the details on, but like the amount of power that goes into choosing each individual character in a response is very low. And because that power is very low at the character level, when you ask it for something that's going to have a numeric output, you run the risk of getting a sketchy output. However, code is written in words, and it's exceptionally good at the word level. So if you want to get numbers out of it, I almost always recommend to people ask it to do something in code, which you can trust number outputs from, rather than asking it to do math, which it's just not a good choice for. It's a little bit like someone saying, what's faster, a Ferrari or a hot air balloon? And it's like, well, depends. Are you traveling left to right, or are you traveling up? And in this case, it's like, I probably wouldn't use the Ferrari for the thing where I need to climb. But in any event, the more articulate you can be about exactly what you want, the more you can trust the precision. And the more vague you are about what you want, the more sketched out you need to be, and the more skeptical you need to be of the response.
And building on that idea, Jack talked about his second brain, and that's a way to create context. So imagine for a moment your second brain had every document you've ever created that you actually yourself rate. So let's say you've created 10,000 documents, but you really rate 1,000 of them as being your best work. Or you went head to head with another lawyer and you lost. They just did a better job than you. You've got their documents and you load those into your context. And now you're actually using a body of content that is your own. And now you can query that and say, hey, I want to create a new lease agreement, and I want to draw from the very best lease agreements I have. And I've rated them in this way. Now do a draft. And that draft is going to be based on your own work, a lot better than anything maybe you could have imagined it would be. But it will still require a review. And then you could do a side-by-side analysis, which would be another way to give you sort of, did it really do the things I asked it to do? I mean, Jack talked about skills, which I don't know if everybody in the room is using skills, but quick show of hands, anybody using skills? So if you wanted to accelerate your ability to get better results, you would create skills. By the way, word of warning, when somebody offers to download 1,000 free skills, do not do it. Number one source of malware today is skills. So don't take anything free. There's nothing free. Build your own skills. That's time well spent, and you'll get really good results out of it. And start small and experiment, and I think you'll find some good results.
I had no idea about the skill thing, but it throws me back to, does anyone remember the toolbars era of the web? Download this toolbar? Oh, God.
Yes.
Hi, Brandon from Metropolis. We build technology for the parking industry. In 2024, we raised $1 billion and took the largest parking operator private. And since then, it's been a nonstop thought exercise on how we can rebuild their processes from the ground up using AI. And I'm curious, from where you guys sit up there, very tactically speaking, if you were to start your company over again, what's one process or one function that you would reimagine with AI, and what would the net effect be on your business?
I love that question. I just want to start by saying that I've always been fascinated by the parking business, because truly it is the dumbest business in the world, right? I mean,
It's very dumb. Let's talk after this.
A truly dumb business. I'm also a customer, as it happens, because you guys bought my parking garage, and they came to me the other day with all this, hype about all the things that we're going to improve now that Metropolis is actually rolling out AI into the parking lot. So I asked the guy a few questions, and it got thin very, very quickly. But the big solution was that we're going to put all the monthly regulars who pay a premium on the bottom of the garage. And I thought, no, you don't understand what made me pay the $600 a month to be here. So I'd love to have a conversation with that. But to get back to your question, the opportunity in your business is the fact that there is literally no technology in it at all. And so, yes, you do get to think about, okay, let's assume for a moment that the people you have valet parking the cars are not, they're certainly not the brightest in the world, right? They're there because that's the best job that they can get. What can you do to incentivize them? Like, can you give them a map? They know exactly what spot to put the car in, or they know which 3 cars need to be moved in order to optimize the parking on the 3rd floor. I imagine there's a lot of things that you could do that if they could, for example, and be simplistic about it, you're in a really busy location and there's 1,000 people who come in who are dailies, and you can take them from a 10-minute wait to a 2-minute wait because you're more efficient. Well, they're all going to thank you for that. That's time you've just given them back. So I would say, I love the idea that you're going after. I'm super curious to see how far you can take it. But my instinct would be to say that you started in a dumb business, so anything you do is going to improve that. And maybe it's a little bit harder to eke out some of those same gains in a business that's very tech-enabled. But I love what you're doing. Oh, specifically. Well, I started my first AI business about 2010, and Margaret here in the front row helped me to put that business on the map. But we were doing deterministic AI models to find audiences online, and we weren't using any of the probabilistic things that we all think about today, these large language models. And it was very, very difficult. And I had 30 engineers built for 5 years to create a product that actually worked at scale. So that was my first time to AI enable anything. And it was a very big bet because you had to, take in investors and spend $20 million to sort of do that. It was a bet that fortunately paid off. I sold the company 3 years ago. And when I started thinking about what I wanted to do next, it never for a moment crossed my mind that it wouldn't be something in AI. And this is before the kind of wave really got going. So I spent about 6 months just thinking about what would a business be that would add value to thousands of companies and add value from their earliest stages of their AI adoption all the way through to being very sophisticated. So that's how I thought about it for my business. And along the lines of that, I invested very early in building technology tools that would help us to do that at scale. And that work continues. So it'll never really be finished. Not sure if that fully answers your question, but I've leaned in as hard as I could and invested everything I could along the way to try to be first in something. And we were the first customer data platform in the world using AI. And we are, I think we were the first real consulting and sort of transformation business for AI, at least one of the first in New York, and continue to sort of try to figure out what the future of that looks like. It's going to be very different in a few months, I think.
So for my 2 jobs, for teaching, I generally have 50 people in the sections of my class. And on a one-off basis on each assignment, I read every single assignment myself and I respond because I love that part of teaching. But it can be hard with my other work and with that many students to track an individual student's progress over the course of the semester. So I often feed the assignments into one of these systems and be like, what are some of the things that any given student is systematically not getting? So that I can make sure that when I'm giving them feedback, I can be like, Chris, again, like you have to think about blah, blah, blah. Like, and honestly, I think one of the most impactful things that AI will do in the world is education needs some pretty fundamental changes as far as scalability and access are concerned. And the ability to personalize education at the individual student level and carry that personalization through your academic career is going to fundamentally change what the academic experience is going to look like, which I think is incredibly valuable and exciting. So on that front, that's something I do. A meta answer, lowercase m, about your question is, I said in the beginning that firm level variability was the important concept. And firm level variability is entirely predicted off of the thing you're talking about, which effectively is if you just bolt on a technology and you don't change process, you get no value. So for example, when the electric dynamo was invented to replace the steam engine, Every factory installed the just took out the steam engine and put the electric dynamo in the same place, and they didn't change anything, and there was absolutely no change. It offered no value. It was when they reformatted the entirety of how the floor was put together, knowing that, oh, steam pressure doesn't matter anymore, and now we can optimize for flow, everything else. That's when productivity went through the roof. So the more we're thinking about, oh, how do we just do the same things we do today, but with AI, the more likely we're not going to see any change. I mentioned one thing before I think is really important in our business, which is I want to see a working product first rather than talk about concepts and slides. But I think the other thing to think about is what we're finding is two things. One, you can build stuff so fast that the new gap is people don't actually have good ideas. We used to think that it was like, I have so many good ideas, but I don't have enough people to build them. And now you can build stuff so fast, you're actually like, we actually don't have that many good ideas. You know, which is like fairly sobering. No, the idea factory really coming up dry today. So I think like the act of being way in front of the engineering team from a design and product and research perspective, and really knowing where it is you want to go and having a really clear vision, and you can't outsource that to AI. That's like you as a leader showing up and doing the thing. It's like that's really, really important now. And the ability to execute obviously is important, but to some extent, the ratio of execution to strategy and vision might shift a little to where if you're lighter on vision and strategy, you may find that execution starts to get really janky. The other one is that this is consumer product specific, but it's really important in case anyone cares about that topic, which is when you are relying on these things to write code, there's more bugs. And so you just have to, if you've heard the expression dog fooding a product, of like using the product yourself, eating your own dog food was the expression, but you have to be using the products all the time. And I think a lot of people work in consumer technology, this may sound surprising, but don't actually use the products a lot. They like build the product and then ship it. And they're like, well, I worked so closely on it, I know everything about it. But then like users instantly find 10 ways that it's totally fundamentally broken that you hadn't considered. And so I think people need to dramatically ramp up how frequently and how, you know, and how sophisticatedly they're using these tools more and more and more, because you're going to find more and more little jagged edges on the things that you ship, which can really leak customers, especially at scale.
We're going to take one more question, and then we're going to be mindful and respectful of the time, and we'll leave a little time for people to mill about before we wrap up entirely for the evening. So I want to make sure you have a chance to answer your question.
Thank you.
Ask your question.
David, Jack, thank you guys for taking the time, Marianne. Thank you for hosting such a fantastic event. You see, or you read a lot of stories in the news. On one side, you have companies burning $500 million of tokens in a month. On the other side, you have companies laying off 50% of their staff because they're seeing incredible gains in efficiency. And then in the middle, we have people like Jack saving 50 hours on wedding planning. When you have such a wide aperture of outcomes, how are you thinking about, and Marianne, maybe this is specific to you, how are you thinking about rolling out AI within your enterprise to make sure you aren't the one burning $500 million a month?
I think that we're working with David's company because what we're first doing is how is personal productivity able to be improved, start easy, make people's lives better, more efficient, and make sure that we're not putting our secret sauce at risk. So we've done a lot of thinking around making sure that we are responsible about using the language models, allowing team members to use technology and AI to make them more productive. And I think that it's a little bit of what you talked about, which is I'm not at all worried about the stuff that I think about every day. I just want to go faster. I want to do it better. I want to spend less money, and I want to be ahead of the curve. And so things like chasing business, like RFPs, it's unbelievable because it knows exactly how we talk about our business. And we're doing really, really solid work. We always try to do really, really solid response work, but we will compete for more with less time and money because it's just gotten better at knowing how we roll. And it's compress the amount of time that you put these massive proposals together. And we like to get a lot of work for free. And there's just a lot of tools out there to help us until we actually win the business and raise the money. And that has has changed exponentially because of whether it's making renderings or high quality drawings or problem solving. So it's really allowing us to chase business faster and better. And then I'm obsessed with the redundant tasks. Like I never wanted to have 60 risk managers and 40 accountants. Like that does not get me excited. But we have to manage risk and we have to pay the bills. These things are, you're doing the same thing over and over again. And so why can't we figure out a better way to do it? And I'm a big believer that AI can change the routine, repetitive tasks of our business. Of course, somebody has to pay attention to it. It has to be an enabling feature. But I think our business can be improved so that the brain power that I have, right, the brain trust, that we're sitting around talking about different things that are so much more important and impactful, and the malaise of the redundant tasks and the repetition and things that come along with building beautiful buildings and making complex business decisions. Let's just strip out a lot of the redundancy and have it work better. So that's how I'm thinking about it. It's probably pretty tactical, but it's really exciting for me because we're just working smarter every day. And we're not even really scratching the surface, but we're in good hands, and I think we're going to get better, and the team is really, really excited about it. So
just to be brief, I think Marianne's answer is excellent. To be brief, I'd say one of the CEOs who announced that they were firing 50% of their staff is a notorious overhirer who was just using AI as cover for backing up the fact that they had tremendously overhired. I think you're going to see some more of that from other people as well. It's very convenient to talk about these massive gains to unwind the fact that you overhired so much during COVID. One thing that's sort of like one peek behind the curtain for folks, I suppose, is that the technology sometimes is just too expensive. And the reason the technology is too expensive is because our understanding of software, like this invention is a profound invention in human history, and I sincerely can't emphasize this enough, but software has so outpaced hardware development that the hardware we have isn't really well equipped to do this in a cost-effective way. It takes so much electricity and so much power, and you need to throw so many chips at the problem, which is why NVIDIA is, worth a gajillion dollars, right? But NVIDIA is worth a gajillion dollars in part because it's the hardware just isn't there to do this more effectively. And we're everyone in the industry is dying to do it more effectively. So I think hardware has to catch up to software, which is going to change the cost curve as well. And companies will get more effective at understanding how to do interesting things. David was talking about a really interesting strategy before on managing token consumption that I think is a great idea as well, which I'm sure he can tell you more about. But I think part of it too is all numbers in context. 500 million, burning 500 million tokens sounds, $5 million on tokens sounds crazy. Except if you're saving $600 million in OpEx. And so for us, in some of our contexts, when we think about the value we can get, imagine if you want 10x productivity, you can either get that by having the same output with 10 times fewer people or having 10 times more output with the same number of people, and everybody's going to fall somewhere in the spectrum. We definitely are seeing situations where all of a sudden you have one engineer that can do the work of 4 engineers, which in our, ideally what we would do with that is create 4 times more growth. I've yet to meet the CEO that's actually, I'd like to keep revenue flat and just increase profitability. Everybody wants both, right? So go do both.
I would just say intended and unintended consequences do matter. If you create, let's say your intention is to instruct your team, go make things, go be a maker, and you don't put any guardrails on your token consumption, and then you end up with a very big bill, well, that's a problem, right? That's an unintended consequence of sort of trying to get your organization to be more AI, to lean in on AI. So I would just say, if you think ahead and you say, well, here's some things we definitely don't want to have happen, and here are the things we do want to have happen, and how do you align those incentives? Because if you create the wrong incentives, you're going to create the wrong behavior, right? And then you'll get the wrong output. So I think that's the most crucial thing I would say. And beyond that, I think none of that's possible if you don't have a plan and a strategy, a roadmap of where you're going and what your priorities are. Because if you're just dabbling or doing a whole bunch of dabbling, then you'll end up, maybe with the wrong result. And that, I think that $500 million quote may be an AI generated missive, but we're still trying to track down the real source.
So I want to wrap up with a fun fact and an idea. My fun fact is that Jack Hanlon was born on a college campus and took naps in my dresser drawer because his mother was my roommate. And so on that, it is mind-blowing because I'm so fortunate to have Jack in my world, but for all of his life. It's one of the best things Fordham has going for it is Jack Hanlon being born there. So because of that, that's my fun fact. And my big idea is I think that because of that, I could convince Jack to come back again. And for David, I'm a client, so that's going to happen. And maybe I hate salons. People say, I want to invite you to a salon. I'm like, I'm not going to I'll go to a hair salon. I'm not going to go to I don't like those things, but I like this a lot. And I'm wondering, what if we did it again? Because what we know is things are going to change. Like that we know, and it's going to happen at warp speed. So maybe at Mag Partners, we try to curate a quarterly, maybe it's too much for Jack to commit, but I think we should do this again because there clearly are not enough hours in the evening, at least to keep all of us utterly captivated by this discussion. And if you guys are up for it, I'm willing to take the responsibility for making it happen. And I just want to thank you all for I want to thank our speakers. I mean, can we just give it up? Amazing. And you're a really good audience because you're curious, and that's obvious. And you're here because of that. And we appreciate your time, and we welcome you to have a cocktail before leaving, and we will see you again. So thank you.